Good evening and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. There's no rush tonight. Nothing to solve, nothing to remember, nowhere at all that you need to be. Wherever you are right now, curled beneath a blanket, sinking into a pillow, resting in the dark with your eyes already growing heavy, you're exactly where you're meant to be. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the day, with all its noise and hurry, begin to loosen and drift away behind you. Tonight, we're going to travel somewhere far away and long ago. We're going to sail north, across cold grey seas, to a world of long dark winters and short golden summers, of firelight glowing warm inside timber halls while the wind moves over the fjords outside. A world of longships drawn up on the shingle, of turf-roofed houses with the smoke rising slow and blue into the northern sky. The world of the Vikings. And I promise you, this isn't going to be a story of battles and blood. There'll be no clashing swords tonight, no burning monasteries, no dragon-proud ships bearing down out of the mist. We're going to do something far gentler than that, and I think far more surprising. We're going to sit down at their tables. We're going to look into their pots, and their bowls, and their wooden cups. We're going to find out what these people actually ate, every ordinary day, in every ordinary house, from the poorest farmer scraping by on a windswept hillside all the way up to the great chieftain in his firelit hall. Because whatever else the Vikings did, and they did a great deal, they were first and last, farmers and fishermen and cooks. They rose in the cold before dawn. They milked their cows and their sheep and their goats. They ground their grain and baked their bread and stirred their porridge and brewed their ale. They gathered berries in the brief bright summers and salted away their fish against the long dark winters. Every single one of them, warrior or not, had to eat. Every single day. And the story of how they did it turns out to be one of the warmest, homeliest, most deeply human stories you could ever hope to hear. So settle in, get comfortable, pull the covers up a little higher if you like. There's nothing here you need to hold on to, and nothing you need to do. If your mind wanders, let it wander. If your eyes close, let them close. My voice will simply keep going, soft and low, carrying you along, like the slow rocking of a boat on a calm and sheltered sea. We're going to gather up 100 small facts tonight, 100 little glimpses into the food and the drink of the Norse world, more than 1,000 years ago. How they farmed the thin northern soil, how they fished the icy seas, how they kept their food from spoiling through winters with no ice and no tins and no cold store of any kind. What they believed about certain foods and why. What they served at their great feasts and what they whispered over their brimming cups of mead. And again, what a single mouthful could quietly say about who a person was and where they belonged in the wide web of the Viking world. Because for these people, just as for so many others across the long span of history, food was never only food. It was survival, yes, but it was also friendship and loyalty and worship and memory. It was the thread that bound a household together through the darkest months of the year. It was the gift a farmer set before his king. It was the offering laid out for the old gods. It was the shared cup passed hand to hand around a fire, sealing bonds that might last a lifetime. So let's begin where nearly all of them began. Not on the deck of a ship, and not on a raid, but at home. In a low, warm, turf-walled house, with the fire glowing in its long central hearth, and the good smell of porridge rising gently into the smoky dark. Let's step inside and warm ourselves and see what there is to eat. Imagine, for a moment, that you are waking in such a house. It's early, very early, and outside the small world is still black and cold, the stars hard and bright above the frost. But in here, it's warm. The fire in the long hearth down the middle of the room has burned low overnight, banked carefully so it would not go out, and now someone is feeding it again, coaxing the embers back to life. The walls around you are thick, turf and stone, built to hold the heat and keep the wind at bay, and the roof above is turf too, sometimes with grass growing right on top of it, so that from a little distance the whole house looks almost like a low green hill with smoke drifting up from it. There is no chimney. The smoke finds its own slow way out through a hole in the roof, and it hangs in a soft haze up among the rafters, which is why everything up there is black and glossy with the gathered soot of many winters. The air smells of wood smoke and of animals and of earth, and underneath it all of something warm and starchy and good, because already the pot is on the fire, and already someone is thinking about the first meal of the day. This is a farmstead, and nearly everyone in the Viking world lived on one, in one way or another. Your life here is shaped by two great forces above all others, the land and the light. And in the far north, the light is a strange and powerful thing. In summer it hardly leaves at all. The sun barely dips below the horizon, and the nights glow pale and silver, and you can work almost around the clock, bringing in the hay and the harvest. But in winter it hardly comes at all. The sun crawls low and weak across the sky for a few short hours, if it shows itself at all, and then the long dark closes in again. And so everything, absolutely everything, about how these people ate was shaped by that great swinging rhythm of light and dark, of feast and want, of the brief green abundance of summer and the long grey endurance of winter. Let's look now into the pot, because in this house, as in nearly every Norse house, there is very often a pot. Fact 1. The single most important foundation of the Viking diet was not meat at all, and it certainly wasn't the great slabs of roasted flesh of the popular legend. It was grain, cereal grains, barley above all, along with oats and rye, were quite simply the backbone of daily life in the Norse world. They were the thing that filled the belly, the thing that kept a working body going through long hours of hard labor, the thing that stood between a family and hunger through the endless dark of winter. The fierce raider of the sagas went about his day, far more often than not, on a stomach full of grain. It's a lovely thing to sit with, that image, the great helmeted warrior of our imagination, who in truth spent far more of his life bent over a porridge bowl than a battlefield. Grain was the first thing thought of in the morning, and the last thing counted before sleep, the quiet measure of whether a household would come safely through to spring. Everything else in the Norse diet gathered around it, the way a family gathers around a fire. Fact 2, and of all the grains, barley was king. Barley grew where other, fussier crops would fail, in thin soil in short seasons, in the cool, damp summers of the north, and this hardiness made it the great staple of the entire Viking world. It was ground into flour for bread, boiled up into porridge, and just as importantly, brewed into ale. Wherever the Norse settled, from Denmark to the Scottish Isles to the wild new farms of Iceland, barley followed them, patient and dependable, doing the quiet work of keeping people alive. Fact 3. The most everyday meal of all, the one that appeared on the table morning after morning, was porridge. Grains, most often barley or oats, were simmered slowly in water or in milk until they softened into a thick, warm, filling mush. It was plain, and it was humble, and it was eaten so constantly that we can hardly imagine a Norse day without it. But picture it, steaming gently in a wooden bowl on a cold black morning, sweetened perhaps with a little honey or studded with a few dried berries, and you begin to understand why it was so loved, and so central, and so quietly essential to life in the north. There is a deep comfort in a bowl of hot porridge on a cold morning that needs no explaining across 1,000 years. It is one of those simple human pleasures that binds us gently to those long-vanished people. They warmed their hands around the same steam we would, and felt the same slow spreading warmth in the belly, before setting out into the same cold dark to do the day's work. In a hard land, that small reliable warmth was a genuine daily kindness, and it began, morning after morning, with the humble pot of grain and milk on the fire. Fact 4. Alongside the porridge, always, there was bread. But the bread of the Norse was a very different thing from the tall, soft, golden loaves we know today. It was most often flat, dense, and rather heavy, baked from coarsely ground barley or rye flour. Sometimes it was cooked on a flat stone set beside the fire, or on a special iron griddle or pan, turning it into something much closer to a flatbread or a hardy little cake than to a risen loaf. It was food for filling the belly and fueling the body, not for delicacy, bread you could hold in your hand and tear with your teeth, honest and plain and satisfying. Fact 5. And archaeologists have actually found this bread, or at least the charred remains of it, buried in the ground for over 1,000 years. At the great trading town of Birka in Sweden, and at other Norse sites, excavators have uncovered small round loaves and fragments of bread preserved by fire, accidentally burned, perhaps, and then dropped or discarded, and so kept for us across all these centuries. These little blackened relics are strangely moving things to hold in the mind. The actual bread, from actual hands, baked on an actual morning more than 1,000 years gone. Fact 6. Some of that surviving bread has given up a rather surprising secret, too. When researchers looked closely at certain fragments, they found that the flour had been mixed with all sorts of other things to stretch it and bulk it out, including ground-up peas and the bark of pine trees, and even dried legumes. In lean years, or simply as a matter of thrift, the precious grain was extended with whatever else could be found, exactly as poorer people did all across the medieval world. Hunger and thrift made inventive bakers of the Norse just as surely as they did of everyone else. Fact 7. The grain was ground into flour at home by hand, using a simple tool called a quern, 2 flat circular stones, one turning against the other, with the grain trickled in between them to be crushed into meal. This was slow, hard, repetitive work, done day after day, and it fell like so much of the food work of this world, very largely to the women of the household. To grind enough flour for a family's daily bread and porridge took real time and real effort, and the steady rhythmic scrape of stone on stone must have been one of the most familiar sounds of any Norse home. Fact 8. That grinding, though, left a quiet and rather grim mark on the food itself. Because the querns were made of stone, tiny fragments of grit wore off the grinding surfaces and mixed invisibly into the flour. Over a lifetime of eating bread and porridge full of these fine stone particles, people's teeth were slowly, steadily worn down, and archaeologists today can see the evidence plainly in the flattened, ground-down teeth of Norse skeletons. The very act of milling their daily bread was, little by little, wearing away the teeth of the people who ate it. Now let's turn from grain to the animals, because the Norse were, above everything else, farmers of livestock, and their beasts gave them far more than just meat. Fact 9. The most important animal on a Norse farm was, very often, the cow. Cattle were treasured, a genuine measure of a family's wealth and standing, and they were valued at least as much for their milk as for their meat. A good milk cow was a walking larder that renewed itself day after day, giving up its precious white bounty to be drunk fresh, or far more often, turned into the great array of dairy foods that sat right at the heart of the Norse diet. To own many cattle was to be rich. To lose them was to face real hardship. Fact 10. And the Norse were absolute masters of dairy. This is one of the great truths of their food, and one of the most surprising. From the milk of their cows, sheep, and goats they made an astonishing variety of things: butter, curds, whey, buttermilk, and several kinds of cheese. Milk in its fresh form spoiled quickly, especially in the warmer months, and so the real art lay in transforming it, again and again, into forms that would keep and nourish through the long, lean seasons. Dairy was not a side dish in this world. It was a foundation stone. If you had to name the two great pillars on which the whole Norse diet stood, they would be these: grain and dairy, the field and the herd, the porridge pot and the milk pail. A Norse household without its cows and its cheeses and its butter would have been a household in real trouble. And so the daily rhythm of milking, straining, churning, and curdling ran through every ordinary day like a heartbeat, quiet and constant, and utterly essential. Fact 11. The most famous Norse dairy food of all was skyr, and this is a lovely thread of history, because skyr is still made and eaten in Iceland to this very day, more than 1,000 years after the Vikings first carried it there. Skyr is a soft, thick, sour, yogurt-like fresh cheese, naturally low in fat and remarkably high in protein. It was made by warming milk, curdling it, and straining it, and it kept far better than fresh milk ever could. To taste skyr today is, in a very real sense, to taste the Viking age, a food that has survived, almost unchanged, across all these centuries. There is something quietly wonderful in that thought, that a food made by Norse hands more than 1,000 years ago, on windswept Icelandic farms at the edge of the world, is still being made and eaten today by the descendants of those same settlers in much the same way. Few foods can claim so unbroken a thread back into the deep past. When a modern Icelander sits down to a bowl of skyr, they are joined, across 1,000 years, to the very first settlers who carried the knowledge of it across the northern sea, a small, living link to the vanished world we are wandering through tonight. Fact 12. Butter, too, was hugely important, and not only as a food. Butter was a way of storing the goodness of summer milk against the hungry winter, and it could be salted and packed away to keep for a very long time. In fact, butter was so valuable that it was sometimes used almost as a form of wealth in itself, given as a payment or a render, hoarded in great quantities. In later centuries in the north, people would even bury casks of butter in the cold, wet peat bogs to preserve it, and bog butter, astonishingly, is still occasionally dug up today, thousands of years old. Fact 13. Then there was whey, the thin, sour, watery liquid left behind when milk was curdled and the curds were strained away to make cheese. To us, whey might sound like a waste product, something to be poured away. But the Norse wasted almost nothing, and whey was far too useful to throw out. Soured whey, it turned out, was a natural preservative, mildly acidic, and it could be used to store other foods, meat and fish and more, keeping them safe through the winter, submerged in great vats of the tangy stuff. Fact 14. This whey preservation gave the Norse one of their most distinctive and enduring food traditions, one that lingers in Iceland even now. Food stored in soured whey took on a sharp, sour, fermented flavor all their own, and over time this became not just a way of keeping food, but a taste that people actually came to love and to seek out. The famous sour, pickled dishes of traditional Icelandic cooking, still eaten at midwinter festivals today, descend directly from this ancient Norse art of keeping the summer's bounty alive in barrels of whey. Fact 15. Sheep and goats were kept right alongside the cattle, and they too gave milk as well as meat and wool. Goats in particular were wonderfully hardy and undemanding, able to thrive on rough, poor grazing where a cow might struggle, and they were valued accordingly. Sheep's milk and goat's milk went into the same great cycle of cheese and butter and curds and whey, and their meat, when the time came, went into the pot. On a Norse farm, almost every animal was expected to earn its keep in more ways than one. Now let's think about meat itself, because while the Norse ate far less of it day to day than the legends suggest, meat still mattered enormously, especially at the great feasts and the turning points of the year. Fact 16. The pig was, here as in so much of the medieval world, the great meat animal of the ordinary household. Pigs were relatively easy to keep, able to feed themselves by rooting and foraging, and they could be fattened up and slaughtered to give a good quantity of meat and fat. Pork was probably the most commonly eaten meat across much of the Norse world, and the pig had a place of honor in the Viking imagination too. In the halls of the gods themselves, the fallen warriors of Valhalla were said to feast each night on the flesh of a magical boar that was reborn again each morning, endlessly. That the Norse should have placed a pig at the very center of their heaven tells you something warm and true about how much they loved good pork. The boar of Valhalla, called Sihrimnir, was cooked each day and eaten by all the honored dead, and each morning it was whole again, ready to be feasted upon anew, a beautiful dream of meat without end, dreamed up by a people who knew all too well what it was to run short of it. Fact 17. Beef was eaten as well, of course, but cattle were valuable enough as milk givers, and as beasts of burden that they weren't slaughtered lightly. A cow was usually killed for its meat only when it was old, or when the winter feed ran short, or on a special occasion when a great quantity of meat was needed for a feast. The killing of a cow was a significant event, yielding a great store of meat all at once, meat that then had to be eaten quickly, or more often, preserved with care to make it last. Fact 18. Horses hold a strange and fascinating place in the Norse food story. Horse meat was eaten, and indeed it was closely bound up with the old pagan religion. Horses were sacrificed to the gods at great ritual feasts, and their flesh was then eaten by the worshippers as a sacred act. This is part of why the eating of horse meat became such a charged and contested thing when Christianity arrived in the north. The new faith frowned deeply upon it, precisely because it was so tangled up with the old heathen sacrifices. For a time, the willingness to eat horse became almost a quiet marker of which gods a person truly served. Fact 19. When it came to the slaughter, nothing whatsoever was wasted. This was a world far too close to the edge of hunger to permit any waste at all. When an animal was killed, its blood was carefully caught and used, made into blood sausages and blood puddings, much like the black pudding known across so much of Europe. The organs, the offal, the fat, the marrow and the bones, all of it was eaten or put to use. Even the bones themselves were boiled for their goodness, and then sometimes carved into tools and toys and pins. The animal gave everything, and everything was gratefully received. Fact 20. The Norse also kept and ate a good deal of poultry, and the remains of chickens turn up on Viking Age sites again and again. Hens gave eggs as well as meat, making them doubly useful, and their small size made them easy to keep even on a modest farm. Ducks and geese were kept too, both the tame farmyard kind and, through hunting, their wild cousins. Eggs from hens, from ducks, from wild seabirds gathered on the cliffs were a valued food, rich and nourishing, and a welcome addition to the pot or the pan. Let's turn now to the sea, because for so many of the Norse, especially those who lived along the endless indented coastlines of Scandinavia and the islands of the north, the sea was the greatest larder of all, vast, cold, and astonishingly generous to those who knew how to harvest it. Think of the shape of the Norse homelands, the deep, winding fjords of Norway, the scattered islands of the north and west, the long coasts of Denmark and Sweden. This was a world where the sea was never far away, where a great many people lived within sight and sound and smell of the water, and where the boat was as familiar and necessary a thing as the plough. For these coastal folk, the sea was not a barrier but a road and a field both at once, a road that carried them out to trade and raid and settle, and a field that fed them, day after day, year after year, with a bounty that the thin northern soil could never match on its own. Fact 21. Fish was absolutely central to the Norse diet, for many communities quite as important as grain, and for some even more so. The cold northern waters teemed with fish, and the Norse fished them with hooks and lines, with nets, and with traps, taking a great bounty from the sea to feed themselves through the year. For coastal families, a day's fishing could mean the difference between a full winter store and a hungry one, and the skills of the fishermen were prized and passed down carefully from one generation to the next. Fact 22. Of all the fish, two stood far above the rest in importance: herring and cod. Herring swam in vast, shimmering shoals that could be netted in enormous quantities when they came close to shore, providing a sudden, seasonal glut of oily, nourishing fish. Cod, meanwhile, were caught in the deeper, colder waters and were prized above all for how superbly they could be preserved. Between them, the humble herring and the mighty cod fed a great swathe of the Norse world, fresh in season and preserved for all the long months between. Fact 23. And the preservation of that cod gave the Norse one of their most important foods of all: starkfish. Cod was hung up to dry in the cold, clean, windy air of the northern winter, not salted, simply dried, until the flesh became hard as wood and would keep for months, even years. This dried starkfish was light, durable, and packed with nourishment, and it could be stored away in vast quantities or carried aboard ship on the longest of voyages. When you wanted to eat it, you soaked it and pounded it back to something like softness. Starkfish was, in a sense, the perfect food for a seafaring people, a food that would not spoil and would not weigh down the ship. Picture the great wooden drying racks along the northern shores, hung heavy with split cod stiffening in the wind, the air sharp with salt and cold, a scene that would have been utterly ordinary to the Norse, and that is still, to this day, a familiar sight in parts of the far north. That humble hardened fish, so easily overlooked, was quietly one of the foundations on which the whole seafaring, far-voyaging world of the Vikings was built. Without a food that could travel, the great voyages could not have traveled either. Fact 24. Herring, being oily, could not simply be dried like cod. The fat would turn rancid. And so herring was most often preserved instead by salting, packed away in barrels between layers of precious salt to keep it through the winter. Salted herring became a great staple of the northern winter table, and the herring trade would go on to shape the economies of the north for many centuries after the Viking Age itself had ended. That silvery little fish, so easily overlooked, was quietly one of the most important foods in all of northern Europe. Fact 25. Salmon and trout, running up the cold, clear rivers of the north, were another welcome catch, prized for their rich pink flesh. And where rivers and lakes offered freshwater fish, the Norse took those too: pike, perch, and more, adding variety to the endless herring and cod. Fish, in all its forms, was simply woven through the fabric of Norse, eating in a way that's hard for us, in our world of easy meat, to fully imagine. Many a Norse meal was, at its heart, a fish meal. Fact 26. And the sea offered far more than fish alone. Along the shores, the Norse gathered shellfish in abundance: mussels, oysters, cockles, whelks, and limpets, prized from the rocks and dug from the sand at low tide. These were humble foods, easy to gather, and archaeologists find their discarded shells heaped up in great middens at coastal Norse sites, the ordinary rubbish of countless ordinary meals. Seabirds and their eggs were harvested from the cliffs as well, sometimes at real peril, by those brave or desperate enough to climb for them. Fact 27. The very greatest creatures of the sea were fair game too, when fortune offered them. The Norse hunted seals for their meat, their fat, and their skins, and they took walruses in the far north, prized above all for their ivory tusks, but eaten too. and when a whale washed ashore, dead or dying, it was a windfall of staggering proportions. A single-stranded whale could yield a mountain of meat and blubber, enough to feed a whole community, and it was fallen upon with joy. So valuable were these strandings that Norse law codes actually contained detailed rules about who had the right to a beached whale, a sure sign of just how precious such a gift from the sea could be. Indeed, the old Icelandic word for a stroke of great good fortune, a windfall, comes directly from this very thing, from the beaching of a whale. A whale on the shore meant, quite literally, that a whole community might eat well for weeks, and so it entered the very language as a byword for luck itself. There could hardly be a clearer sign of how close these people lived to the edge, and of how deeply the sea's gifts were woven into their lives and even their words. Fact 28. Seal and whale blubber gave up something else of great value, too: oil. The fat of these great sea beasts was rendered down into oil, which could be used in cooking, but also, crucially, burned in simple lamps to give light through the long, dark northern winters. In a world where the sun vanished for so much of the year, a source of light was as precious as a source of food, and the same animals that filled the belly also, in their way, held back the dark. Now let's leave the shore and walk inland, into the woods and the wild places, because these too were a great pantry for those who knew how to read them. Fact 29. Hunting added meat and variety to the Norse table, especially in the great forests of Scandinavia. The Norse hunted red deer and roe deer, and above all the mighty elk, the great antlered giant of the northern woods, which we in some parts of the world call the moose. They hunted wild boar, dangerous and prized, and smaller game like hares. Hunting was hard, skilled work, and it could not be relied upon to feed a family day to day, but it brought welcome fresh meat, and in the hunting of the great beasts, a share of glory too. Fact 30. The Norse also hunted for fur as much as for food, pursuing animals like bear, fox, marten, and squirrel through the northern forests. The meat of some of these went into the pot, but the real prize was often the pelt. Northern furs were a hugely valuable trade good, sought after across the whole of Europe and beyond, and the fur trade was one of the great engines of Norse wealth. So the hunt fed the family and filled the trading ship both at once. Fact 31. Wild birds of every kind were taken as well: ducks, geese, grouse, ptarmigan, and the great flocks of seabirds that wheeled around the northern coasts and cliffs. Snares, nets, and simple hunting brought these birds to the table, and their eggs were gathered in season too. In a land where every source of food mattered, the birds of the air were a valued and reliable addition, especially in those regions where farming was hardest, and the wild had to make up the difference. Fact 32. And then there was the quiet, patient work of foraging, which added color and flavor and vital nourishment to the Norse diet. In the brief, intense abundance of the northern summer and autumn, people gathered wild berries in great quantities: bilberries, lingonberries, crowberries, cloudberries, and more, the jewel-bright fruits of the northern heaths and forests. These were eaten fresh in their short season, a burst of sweetness in a world with little of it, and they were dried or otherwise preserved to lend their goodness to the winter months as well. Of all these, the cloudberry held a special place, a rare amber gold berry of the far northern bogs, hard to find and much treasured, a genuine delicacy in a world where sweetness was scarce and precious. To go out in the long light of a summer evening and fill a basket with berries was, one imagines, one of the gentler and more pleasant of the endless tasks of the Norse year, a small season of colour and sweetness before the grey months closed in again. Fact 33. Wild plants, leaves, and herbs were gathered too, both to eat and to flavour and to heal. Nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, angelica, and many other plants went into the pot or the salting barrel. Angelica in particular was highly valued, its stalks eaten and its whole plant prized for its many uses. Nuts, especially hazelnuts, were gathered in autumn and stored, a rich, fatty, long-keeping food that was a genuine boon in a northern land. To know the wild plants of your own patch of country, to know what to gather and when, was a real and valuable kind of knowledge. Fact 34. Mushrooms and other fungi were gathered from the damp northern woods as well, springing up after the autumn rains. And honey, precious, precious honey, was sought out wherever it could be found, gathered from wild bees, for it was the only real sweetener this world possessed. There was no sugar in the Viking age, nothing at all like it. And so honey was treasured beyond almost any other flavor, used to sweeten food and drink, and as we shall see, to make the most prized and sacred drink of all. It's worth pausing on that for a moment, a whole world with no sugar at all, where the only true sweetness came from honey, or from ripe fruit and berries in their brief season. A taste that we now have in endless, careless abundance was, to the Norse, something rare and wonderful, and worth real effort to obtain. A little honey drizzled over the morning porridge, or stirred into a cup, was a genuine luxury and a genuine joy, a small brightness against the plainness of daily fare. Let's turn now to how all this food was actually cooked, the practical, daily business of turning raw ingredients into a warm meal, in a house with a single open fire, and no oven as we would know it. It's easy for us, with our stoves and our ovens and our endless gadgets, to forget just how much skill and patience went into cooking over an open hearth. There was no thermostat, no timer, no clean, dry oven waiting at the turn of a dial. There was only the fire, living, changeable, needing to be fed and tended and understood, and the vessels you could hang over it or set beside it, and the long, slow patience of someone who knew, from a lifetime of doing it, exactly when the stew was ready and exactly how the embers should be raked. Cooking was a real and valued craft in the Norse world, learned young and practiced daily, and much of it, like so much of the food work of that world, was the ceaseless, skillful labor of women. Fact 35. The great workhorse of Norse cooking, as of so much cooking across history, was boiling. Meat, fish, grains, and vegetables were simmered together in a large pot or cauldron hung over the central hearth fire, producing hearty, warming stews and soups. This was the most reliable way to cook, gentle, forgiving, and perfect for making tough or humble ingredients tender and nourishing. Much of what a Norse family ate, day to day, came out of that one bubbling pot suspended over the flames. Fact 36. The cauldrons themselves were precious and important objects. The finest were made of iron, or sometimes of soapstone, a soft, workable stone, quarried especially in Norway, that could be carved into cooking vessels and that held and spread heat beautifully. Soapstone parts were traded widely across the Norse world, a genuine and valued item of commerce. A good cauldron was a real investment, passed down and cared for, the beating heart of the household's cooking. Fact 37. There was also a wonderfully ingenious way of cooking without any metal part at all, cooking with hot stones. Stones were heated in the fire until they glowed, and then dropped into a pit or a wooden vessel or a hide bag filled with water and food. The searing stones brought the water to the boil and cooked the meal, and fresh hot stones were added as the first ones cooled. This method, ancient and clever, let people boil and cook even without a costly metal cauldron, using little more than fire, stone, and water. Fact 38. Roasting and grilling meat directly over the fire was done too, especially for feasts, when great joints and whole beasts might be turned on spits before the flames. There's a real drama to roasting, the sizzle, the smell, the sight of the meat browning and crisping, and it made a fine centerpiece for a celebration. But for everyday cooking, roasting was less common than boiling, partly because it was wasteful of precious fat and juices that a pot would have caught and kept. Fact 39. The Norse also baked, in a fashion, though without the great built ovens of the wealthier lands to the south. Flatbreads were cooked on hot flat stones, or on iron griddles and pans, set over or beside the fire. Some foods might be baked in the embers themselves, wrapped and buried in the hot ash. And in some places, food was cooked slowly in earth ovens, pits lined with hot stones, filled with food and covered over to cook gently for hours. Each of these methods made the most of the simple tools and the single fire that a Norse household possessed. Fact 40. And the seasoning of all this food, while simpler than the spice-laden cooking of the rich lands to the south, was far from dull. The Norse had salt, of course, that most essential of all seasonings. They had the sharp, sour tang of whey and of fermentation. They had honey for sweetness, and wild herbs for flavor and fragrance, and they had certain prized flavorings of their own, like the seeds of wild caraway and mustard, and pungent wild garlic and onions. A Norse stew was a simpler thing than a nobleman's spiced dish far to the south, but it was warm and hearty and seasoned with real care. Now, let's spend a while with the vegetables and the gardens, because the Norse grew and gathered a fine range of plant foods, far more than the meat and mead legend would ever suggest. Fact 41. Every Norse farm of any size had its gardens and its plots, where vegetables and useful plants were grown close to the house. The range was good and varied. Cabbages, onions, leeks, garlic, peas, and beans were all cultivated, along with root vegetables and leafy greens. These homegrown vegetables filled out the daily pot, adding bulk and flavor and vital nourishment to the grain and dairy and fish that formed the core of the diet. The image of the Viking as a pure meat eater could hardly be further from the humble truth of the vegetable garden. Fact 42. Cabbage and its leafy relatives were especially important, hardy enough to grow well in the cool northern climate and able to be stored or preserved through the winter. Onions, leeks, and garlic, the whole pungent, flavorful family, were grown and greatly valued. both for the taste they brought to otherwise plain food, and for the healthful qualities the Norse believed they possessed. A part of stew given depth and savor by onions and garlic was a far better thing than the same part without them. Fact 43. Peas and beans were quiet heroes of the Norse diet, just as they were across so much of the medieval world. Dried at summer's end, they could be stored away through the winter without spoiling, and then thrown into the pot to make thick, filling, protein-rich stews and peas puddings. At exactly those times of year when fresh meat was scarce and the winter store was thinning, the humble dried pea and bean delivered precious, life-sustaining protein. They were small and plain, but they did enormous work to keep people fed and strong. There is something quietly heroic about the dried pea. When you think about it, this tiny, unglamorous thing stored away in a sack through the dark months, ready to be dropped into the pot and simmered into a thick, warming, nourishing meal that could carry a laboring body through a winter's day. In a world so often short of meat, it was the humble legume, more than anything grand, that kept people alive and on their feet through the leanest weeks of the year. Fact 44. Root vegetables grew well in the northern soil and stored well through the winter, making them another dependable staple. The Norse grew and ate turnips and carrots, though the carrots of that age were not the bright orange roots we know, but paler, whiter, more slender things. These roots could be left in the cool earth or stored in cellars and pits, pulled out as needed through the lean months, a reliable source of nourishment when little else was growing. Fact 45. The Norse also grew and gathered flax and hemp, and while these were valued above all for their fibers, flax for linen cloth, hemp for rope, their seeds were useful too. Flax seeds and hemp seeds are rich in oil and nourishment, and they found their way into the diet as well as into the loom and the rigging. On a Norse farm, so many plants earned their keep in more ways than one, feeding the body and clothing it and equipping the ship all at once. Fact 46. And we should not forget the wild greens gathered from field and forest and shore, which supplemented the cultivated vegetables all through the growing season. Nettles, sorrel, duck, wild cabbage, and many other leafy plants were picked and eaten, boiled soft in the pot. Along the coasts, seaweed was gathered and eaten too, a food easily overlooked, but nourishing and abundant, and a genuine part of the northern diet, especially in the islands and along the rugged shores where farming was hard. Now let's turn to what filled the Norse cup, because their drink tells us nearly as much about them as their food, and it takes us right to the warm, loud, firelit heart of their social world. If the food of the Norse was mostly a quiet, homely, daily thing, the porridge pot, the milk pail, the drying fish, then their drink was where the warmth and the fellowship and the celebration gathered. To understand how the Norse drank, and what, and when, and with whom, is to understand something deep about how they lived together, how they bound themselves to one another, how they honored their gods and their dead and their friends. So let's fill the horn and pass it round the fire and see what we find. Fact 47. The everyday drink of the Norse, as of so many peoples across the medieval world, was ale. It was brewed at home from barley, and it was drunk by very nearly everyone, men, women, and even children, as a staple part of daily life. This everyday ale was not the strong, bitter beer of a modern pub. It was weaker, and it was regarded as much as a food as a drink, a nourishing, calorie-rich liquid that was safer and more pleasant than much of the available water. Think of it as a kind of liquid bread, mild and sustaining. Fact 48. Brewing this ale was, in the Norse world as in so many others, very largely the work of women. It was done at home, as part of the ordinary run of household tasks, and a woman skilled at brewing was a valued woman indeed. The making of good ale took knowledge and care, the malting of the barley, the timing of the brew, the guarding against a batch gone sour, and this skill was passed down and prized. Here, as elsewhere in this age, some of the first independent, respected craftswomen were quite literally brewers. Fact 49. Ale was so central to Norse life that it was woven right into their most important gatherings and rituals. Great communal drinking feasts, where ale flowed freely and the horn was passed from hand to hand, were a cornerstone of Norse society, occasions for celebrating, for sealing agreements, for honoring the gods and the dead, and for binding people together. To drink together was to trust together, to belong together. The ale feast was not mere indulgence. It was one of the great social institutions of the entire Norse world. Fact 50. And the Norse often drank from horns, the actual horns of cattle, hollowed out, cleaned, and sometimes beautifully mounted with metal fittings and decoration. A drinking horn, of course, cannot be set down without spilling, and this is part of its charm and its meaning. Once the horn was filled and placed in your hand, you were meant to drink. The passing of the horn around the hall from one person to the next was a ritual of fellowship and honor, and to be offered the horn, especially by the lady of the house or the lord, was a mark of real regard. Fact 51. Above the everyday ale, for the great occasions and the special feasts, there was mead, and mead was something truly special. Mead was made by fermenting honey and water together, producing a drink that was sweet, potent, and because honey was so precious and hard to come by, genuinely expensive. Mead was not an everyday drink for ordinary people. It was the drink of feasts and ceremonies, of celebration, and of the gods themselves. To serve mead was to declare that this was an occasion that truly mattered. Think of it as the champagne of the Viking world, the drink you brought out for the wedding, the great feast, the sealing of an alliance, the honoring of the dead, the visit of a king. It carried an air of the sacred, and the celebratory about it that plain barley ale, for all its daily comfort and worth, could never quite match. When the mead was poured, everyone in the hall understood. This was no ordinary night. Fact 52. In the myths and the poetry of the Norse, mead held a place of almost magical importance. There was the great tale of the mead of poetry, a wondrous mead, brewed from the blood of a wise being and stolen away by the god Odin himself, which granted the gift of poetry and eloquence and wisdom to any who drank it. To the Norse, mead was bound up with inspiration, with the power of words, with the very art of the poet and the storyteller. It was the drink of gods and kings and skalds, poured out at the moments that mattered most. Fact 53. In the golden vision of Valhalla, the great hall where the honored dead feasted forever, mead flowed without end. It was said to stream endlessly from the udder of a magical goat named Hydrun, who stood upon the roof of the hall and browsed upon the leaves of a special tree, so that the fallen warriors might drink their fill for all eternity. This is a beautiful glimpse into how the Norse imagined their very paradise, an endless feast, with endless meat from the every-born boar and endless mead from the magical goat. Heaven itself, to the Norse, was a hall full of good food and good drink and good company that would never, ever run out. And doesn't that tell you almost everything about these people and about the world they lived in? A people who knew hunger, who knew the anxious counting of the winter store, who knew what it was to run short, such a people, when they dreamed of paradise, dreamed not of gold or ease or endless summer, but of a feast that would never end, of meat that could never run out, of a horn that was always full. To the Norse, the very best thing that eternity could possibly hold was simply this: warmth and plenty and good company, gathered around a fire forever, with never again the fear of going without. Fact 54. The Norse also made fruit wines and other fermented drinks where they could. Where fruit was available, it was fermented into wine-like drinks, though the cool northern climate was not kind to the grapevine. So these were not the grape wines of the south, but drinks made from berries and other local fruits. And that curious dairy drink we glimpsed before, Skyr, a sour, whey-based drink, a byproduct of the Skyr making, was made and drunk as well. One more clever way the Norse wasted nothing and drew nourishment and pleasure from everything their land and animals gave them. Fact 55. True grape wine, imported from the lands to the south, was known to the Norse, but it was a rare and costly luxury, a mark of great wealth and far-reaching connections. To serve real wine at your table, wine that had traveled all the way from the vineyards of Francia or beyond, was to display your reach and your riches in the most unmistakable way. For the great chieftains and kings, with their trading contacts stretching across Europe, a cup of southern wine was a glittering prize, all the more precious for how far it had come. Let's pause now and think about the great shaping force of the Norse year, because, like the peasants of the south, the Norse lived their whole lives by the turning of the seasons, and their eating swung with it between abundance and want. We, who can walk into a shop in the deepest dark of winter and find strawberries and fresh fish, and every kind of food heaped up under bright lights, have very largely forgotten what it means to live at the mercy of the seasons. But for the Norse, the turning of the year was everything. It governed when they could grow and hunt and fish and gather, when they must slaughter and preserve, when they might feast, and when they must ration. The whole shape of their eating was a great slow wheel, turning from the frantic abundance of summer to the careful endurance of winter and back again, year after year, world without end. And in the far north, where the swing between the endless light of summer and the endless dark of winter was so extreme, that wheel turned harder and mattered more than almost anywhere else on earth. Fact 56. The Norse year, when it came to food, was really a tale of two halves, the light half and the dark half. Through the long days of summer and the harvest of autumn, there was, in a good year, real abundance. Fresh milk flowed, animals grazed and fattened, the seas and rivers gave up their fish, the berries ripened, the grain stood golden in the fields. It was a time of plenty, and also a time of frantic, all-consuming labor, because everything gathered in these bright months had to be made to last through the darkness to come. Fact 57. And then came the long, dark half of the year, the winter, when little grew, the animals were housed and fed on stored hay, and the family lived off whatever had been put by. This was the time when all the careful preservation of the summer was put to the test, when the salted fish, and the dried starkfish, and the smoked meat, and the stored grain, and the barrels of soured whey stood between the household and hunger. A well-provisioned house faced the winter with confidence. A poorly provisioned one faced it with dread. The great question hanging over every autumn was simple and stark. Have we put by enough? Fact 58. The autumn, therefore, was the great hinge of the whole year, the season of slaughter and preservation, when the animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed and their meat put by. Only the beasts needed to breed next year's stock and to give milk were kept alive through the cold months, and even these had to be sustained on carefully hoarded hay. The autumn slaughter was a time of hard, bloody, urgent work, but also a brief time of feasting on the fresh meat that could not be kept, a last taste of plenty before the long endurance of winter began. Fact 59. There was a great midwinter festival that stood at the very heart of the dark season, Yule. In the deepest, darkest part of the year, when the sun was at its weakest and the nights were longest, the Norse held a great feast of Yule, a celebration of food and drink and fellowship, a defiant blaze of warmth and plenty flung against the surrounding dark and cold. Great quantities of meat and ale were consumed, the gods were honored, and the community drew together around the fire. Yule was a light in the darkness, in the most literal possible sense, and its warmth echoes down to us still in our own midwinter celebrations. There is something deeply moving in the idea of it, that at the very coldest, darkest, most frightening turn of the whole year, when the sun itself seemed to be failing and the dark pressing close, these people answered not with fear but with a feast. They gathered together, they lit the fires, they brought out the best food and drink they had hoarded, and they ate and drank and told stories and honored the gods, holding the darkness at bay with warmth and light and each other's company. That instinct to answer the darkest night with a shared feast is one of the oldest and most beautiful in all of human history, and we keep it still. Fact 60. Feasting, in general, was one of the most important things the Norse did, far more than mere eating and drinking. A great feast was a display of a chieftain's wealth and generosity, a way of binding his followers to him, of rewarding loyalty, of making and cementing alliances. To feed people lavishly was to show that you were powerful and open-handed and worthy of their allegiance. The chieftain who kept a good hall and a full table drew followers to him. The one who was mean with his food and drink would soon find his hall growing empty. Fact 61. The Norse ideal of the good Lord was, in fact, deeply bound up with the giving of food and treasure. In the poetry, a generous ruler was praised as a ring-giver and a feeder of his people, while a stingy one was scorned. The whole social bond between a leader and his followers was built, in large part, on this exchange. The followers gave loyalty and service, and the Lord gave, in return, feasting and gifts and a place at his fire. Hospitality was not a mere courtesy in this world. It was one of the very foundations on which society itself was built. Fact 62. And hospitality to the traveler and the stranger was held as a sacred duty, too. The Norse had a strong ethic of welcoming and feeding the guest. A stranger arriving at your door cold and hungry was to be given food, drink, and warmth. This is a value that runs deep through Norse poetry and lore. There are famous verses of ancient wisdom advising exactly how a good host should treat a guest, and how a wise guest should behave in turn. In a hard land, where a traveler might otherwise perish, this ethic of hospitality was both a moral good and a practical necessity, and food and drink stood at the very center of it. The old poem of wisdom, known as the Havamal, put into the mouth of Odin himself, gives real and tender attention to exactly this, to how a guest arriving cold and weary needs above all warmth and water to wash, and a good dry welcome and food set before them. There is something wonderfully humane in that ancient counsel, the recognition that a cold, hungry, travel-worn stranger at your door is not a threat, but a fellow human being in need, deserving of the fire and the food and the kindness that you would hope to find yourself, someday, at some other door far from home. Now let's return to the great art that made survival possible in this harsh northern world. The art of preserving food, of cheating decay, of carrying the summer's bounty across the long, dark winter. This, more than almost anything else, was the true secret skill of the Norse, the quiet, patient, invisible art on which every winter and every voyage, and in the end, every life depended. We've touched on it here and there already, in the drying of the cod, and the salting of the herring, and the souring of the whey. But it's worth gathering it all together now, and dwelling on it a while, because there is something genuinely admirable in it, in the sheer cleverness and care with which a people, armed with nothing but salt and smoke and wind and time, made war on rot and hunger, and won, year after year, the long, slow battle to keep themselves fed. Fact 63. In a world with no refrigeration of any kind, preserving food was not a nicety. It was the very difference between life and death through the winter months. And the Norse became extraordinarily skilled at it, masters of every method their world afforded. Everything gathered in the brief abundance of summer and autumn had to be made to last, and so the arts of drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting were among the most vital skills any household possessed. Get the preservation wrong, and no matter how good the harvest had been, the winter could turn deadly. Fact 64. Drying was perhaps the simplest and most important method of all, and the cold, clean, windy air of the north was perfect for it. Fish, above all, was dried. The great stockfish of cod, hung on wooden racks in the open air until it was hard and light and would keep for months or years. Meat could be dried too, and fruits and herbs. Drying required no precious salt and no fire. It needed only the wind and the cold and time, and the north had all three in abundance. It was preservation almost for free, and the Norse relied upon it heavily. Fact 65. Salting was the other great method for fish and meat, though salt itself had to be obtained with effort. In some places the Norse made salt by boiling seawater or by burning seaweed and extracting the salt from the ashes. In others, salt was a traded good, brought from afar. However it was obtained, salt was precious, and it was used to preserve the oily herring that could not simply be dried, and to salt down meat and butter to keep them through the winter. Salted foods emerged strong and lasting, and formed a great part of the winter store. Fact 66. Smoking was used as well, often together with salting, to preserve meat and fish and give it a rich, lasting flavor. Hung in the smoke of the fire, and remember, these houses were full of wood smoke, with no chimney to carry it away. Meat and fish were both preserved and flavored at once. The smoky rafters of the Norse house were, in effect, a great larder, where food could be hung to cure slowly in the rising smoke of the ever-burning hearth. Our own love of smoked fish and smoked meats descends in a direct line from exactly this ancient necessity. Fact 67. And then there was fermentation and souring, perhaps the most distinctively Norse of all their preserving arts, and the one that gave their food its most particular character. We've seen how soured whey was used to keep foods through the winter, submerged in its tangy, acidic protection. Beyond this, fish and other foods were sometimes preserved by fermentation, buried or barreled, and allowed to transform slowly under the action of their own natural processes. The results were sharp, sour, and pungent, an acquired taste perhaps, but a nourishing and long-keeping one, and one that the Norse plainly came to love. Fact 68. The most famous descendant of these fermenting arts survives in Iceland to this very day, and it is not for the faint of heart. There is a traditional Icelandic dish of fermented shark meat buried, pressed, and cured for weeks or months, until it is safe to eat and possessed of a truly formidable smell and flavor. It is eaten still, especially at the midwinter festival, and while its origins are debated, it stands as a vivid, living reminder of just how far the northern peoples were willing to go, and how ingenious they were in their eternal war against spoilage and hunger. The fresh flesh of that particular shark is, in fact, poisonous to eat, and yet the northern people found a way, through long burial and fermentation, to render even this into food. There could hardly be a more striking testament to the sheer determination of a people to wrest nourishment from a hard land, to leave no possible source of food untried, and to turn even the unpromising and the dangerous into something that would carry them through the dark of winter. Fact 69. Butter and cheese, as we've seen, were themselves forms of preserved food, ways of storing the goodness of summer milk against the winter dearth. Hard cheeses could keep for a very long time, and salted butter for longer still. That astonishing bog butter, buried in the cold peat, and sometimes surviving for thousands of years, shows just how seriously the Norse and their neighbors took the storing of this precious fat. Every barrel of butter, every wheel of hard cheese, was a piece of summer captured and kept, a hedge against the hungry dark. Fact 70. And honey, too, was in its way a preservative, for honey itself never spoils, and it could be used to help preserve other foods, and of course to make the mead that would keep and even improve with time. In a world so obsessed, of necessity, with making food last, the Norse reached for every tool they had. The wind, the cold, the salt, the smoke, the souring, the sweet-keeping power of honey. Together, these arts were the invisible foundation beneath every winter table, the quiet skills that carried a people through the dark half of every single year. Let's turn now to how the Norse actually sat down and ate, the practical, daily manners and customs of the Viking table. Fact 71. The Norse typically ate 2 main meals a day. There was the dagmal, the day meal, taken in the morning some hours after rising and the first work of the day, a substantial breakfast to fuel the labor ahead. And there was the natmal, the night meal, taken in the evening when the day's work was done. This rhythm of 2 good meals, morning and evening, shaped the ordinary Norse day, with the hard work of the farm and the household filling the hours between. Fact 72. They ate from bowls and plates of wood, and sometimes of soapstone or pottery, using spoons of wood, bone, or horn, and their own personal knives. The knife was an especially personal and important tool. Nearly everyone, man or woman, carried their own knife at their belt, and it was used for eating as well as for the thousands small tasks of daily life. The fork, as elsewhere in this age, was essentially unknown. Food was eaten with spoon, knife, and fingers, and eating neatly and well was a mark of good breeding. Fact 73. Much of the eating was communal, gathered around the fire and the shared pot in the long central hall of the house. Food was ladled from the great cauldron into bowls or set out to be shared, and people ate together in the warm, smoky, companionable heart of the home. This was a sociable, close-knit way of eating, binding the household, family, workers, and dependents alike, together around the common fire and the common pot. To eat together was, in a very real sense, to be a household together. Fact 74. In the great halls of the chieftains, the seating and serving at a feast followed careful lines of honor and rank, much as they did in the halls of lords far to the south. The high seat, the place of the lord, was the position of greatest honor, and where a guest was seated in relation to it, announced his importance to the whole gathered company. The lady of the house held a place of real honor and authority too, and it was often her role to carry the drink to the guests and to bestow the horn, a gesture of welcome and regard that carried real social weight. Fact 75. Women held a position of genuine importance in the Norse household when it came to food and its keeping. The mistress of the house held the keys, quite literally, the keys to the stores and the chests where the food and valuables were kept, and this was a real symbol of her authority and her responsibility. She oversaw the dairy, the brewing, the preserving, the management of the winter stores. The provisioning of the household through the long year was, in large part, women's work and women's power, and it was recognized and respected as such. Those keys, worn at the belt of the lady of the house, were more than a mere convenience. They were a badge of standing, a visible sign of who held authority over the inner life and the vital stores of the home. And in a world where the survival of the whole household through the winter depended on the wise management of the food supply, on knowing exactly what was in the store and how far it must be made to stretch, that authority was no small thing. The woman who kept the keys held, in a very real sense, the family's survival in her care. Now let's think about who ate well and who ate poorly in the Norse world, because, for all their fierce ideals of fellowship, this was a society with its own sharp divisions of rank and wealth. Fact 76. Norse society was not equal. It was divided, broadly, into 3 great classes. There were the Thralls, the enslaved, the unfree, who did the hardest and lowest work and ate the poorest fare. There were the Karls, the free farmers and craftspeople, the great middling backbone of Norse society, who worked their own land and ate a decent, honest, everyday diet. And there were the Jarls, the noble, the powerful, the wealthy chieftains and their families, who ate the best and richest food the land could offer. What a person ate reflected, quite directly, which of these ranks they belonged to. Fact 77. The enslaved thralls at the bottom ate the plainest and most meager food of all, the simplest porridge and coarsest bread, the least meat, the roughest fare. Their labor helped produce the food that everyone else enjoyed, but their own share of it was small. In a hard world with narrow margins, those at the very bottom felt every shortage first and worst, and their diet was a diet of bare sustenance, of just enough to keep them working, and sometimes, in lean times, of not even that. Fact 78. The free farmers, the Karls, the great majority of the Norse, ate a diet that was plain but generally sufficient and even good. Porridge and bread, dairy in abundance, fish, vegetables from the garden, and meat on feast days and at the autumn slaughter. It was a hearty, wholesome, working diet, monotonous perhaps, but nourishing. This was the true everyday food of the Viking world, the food that fed the farmers and the sailors and the craftsmen who made up the bulk of Norse society, and it was, on the whole, a decent way to eat. Fact 79. The wealthy Jarls at the top ate the richest fare, more meat, and finer cuts of it, more of the precious mead and even imported wine, more of the good things in greater quantity. And crucially, they had the means to hold the great feasts through which power and status were displayed. Yet even here, the everyday difference may have been smaller than we imagine. The chieftain's ordinary weekday supper was likely built on the same grain and dairy and fish as everyone else's. The great gulf between rich and poor showed itself most vividly not in the daily meal, but in the rare and dazzling feast. Fact 80. And so, as with the peoples to the south, the truest difference between the Norse rich and the Norse poor lay less in what they ate on an ordinary day, and more in the feast, in the sheer scale and richness and spectacle of it. On most days, the Jarl and the Karl, and even the Thrall ate versions of the same grain and dairy and fish diet. But the Jarl could summon, when he chose, a feast of staggering abundance, and it was in that abundance, that open-handed display of plenty, that the real distance between the top of society and the bottom was most clearly and unmistakably shown. Now let's follow the Norse out across the seas, because these were, above all, a traveling people, and their food traveled with them and changed as they went. We began this journey at home, at the hearth, with the porridge pot and the milk pail, and it's easy to forget, amid all that homely warmth, that these same people were among the greatest travelers and explorers the world had yet seen. They sailed west to Iceland and Greenland and the shores of a whole new continent. They sailed south to raid and trade along the coasts of Europe. They sailed east down the great rivers of Russia all the way to the shining cities of the Byzantine world. And everywhere they went, they had to eat. And so the story of Norse food is also, in a very real sense, the story of Norse travel, of how a people carried their tables with them to the very edges of the known world, and adapted them, again and again, to whatever strange new shores they found. Fact 81. When the Norse sailed on their long voyages of raiding, trading, and exploration, they carried preserved food that would not spoil aboard ship. Dried starkfish, above all, was the perfect ship's provision, light, durable, packed with nourishment, and all but imperishable. Salted meat and fish, hard cheese, butter, dried fruits, nuts, and grain for porridge and flatbread all went aboard as well. The ability to preserve food so well was, in a real sense, one of the things that made the great Viking voyages possible at all. Fact 82. On the ships themselves, cooking was difficult and often impossible. An open fire aboard a wooden vessel packed with men and cargo was a dangerous thing. And so much of the food eaten at sea was eaten cold and preserved. The starkfish, the salted meat, the cheese and butter and bread. When they could, sailors would put ashore to cook a proper hot meal over a fire on solid ground, a welcome relief after days of cold rations at sea. The seafaring life was a hard one, and its food was, for much of the time, plain and cold and eaten on the move. Fact 83. As the Norse settled new lands, they carried their food ways with them and had to adapt them to what each new place could offer. When they settled Iceland, they brought their livestock and their grain, but found a land where grain grew poorly in the cold, so that farming leaned even harder on sheep and cattle, on fish, and on the wild harvest of the sea and land. Norse food, like Norse people, spread across the north and had to bend and change to fit each new and often harsher home. Fact 84. In Iceland especially, where the growing of grain was so difficult, the diet came to rely enormously on the sea and on the flocks. Fish, mutton, and dairy became the great staples, and the ingenious arts of preservation, the souring, the drying, the fermenting, became more important than ever. Many of the traditional foods of Iceland today, those sharp and sour and fermented dishes eaten at the midwinter feast of Thoroblat, are living descendants of exactly this Viking Age struggle to make food last in a hard, treeless, grain-poor land. Fact 85. Further afield still, the Norse pushed on to Greenland and even briefly to the shores of North America, which they called Vinland, a name that means, wonderfully, wine land, said to have been given because of the wild grapes or berries the explorers found growing there. In these far western settlements, the Norse hunted seals and caribou, fished the cold seas, and struggled to keep their old farming ways alive in an even harsher environment. Their foodways were stretched to the very limit at the edges of the known world, and in Greenland, in the end, that struggle to feed themselves may have been part of what finally undid the settlement. There is a real poignancy in the story of Norse Greenland. For centuries, those settlers clung to their old ways, keeping their cattle and their sheep in a land that grew steadily colder, importing what they could, leaning ever harder on the seals of the sea. And then, at last, as the climate turned against them and the old world receded, the settlements dwindled and fell silent. The daily struggle to feed themselves, which had shaped every Norse life everywhere, became at the very edge of the world a struggle that could no longer be won, a quiet, human reminder of how everything, in the end, comes back to the simple question of whether there is enough to eat. Fact 86. And where the Norse settled among other peoples, in England, in Ireland, in Normandy, in the East, their food mingled with local ways, giving and taking, blending old northern traditions with new local ingredients and customs. Food, like language and blood, flowed both ways in these meetings. The Norse who settled in England, for instance, added their words and their ways to the local food culture, even as they took up local foods in turn. The great movement of the Vikings across the world was, among so many other things, a great mingling of the ways people ate. Now let's turn to what the Norse believed about their food, because for them, as for so many peoples, eating was bound up with faith, with the gods, with the unseen world. In our own age, we tend to think of eating as a plain, practical, everyday thing, cut loose from religion and the sacred. But that would have seemed a very strange idea, indeed, to the Norse. For them, the growing and the giving and the eating of food were shot through with meaning at every turn, bound up with the gods above and the spirits close at hand, with sacrifice and offering and blessing, with the turning of the sacred year. To eat was, very often, also to worship. To feast was, very often, also to pray. So let's step now into the deeper world behind the Norse table and see how their food and their faith were woven together into a single living whole. Fact 87. Food and drink stood at the very center of Norse pagan worship. The great religious feasts, called blot, were feasts of sacrifice. Animals were offered to the gods, and then their meat was cooked and eaten by the worshippers in a shared sacred meal. To feast was, in part, to worship. The eating and the offering were bound together. The blood of the sacrificed animals was sprinkled about as a blessing, and the gods were toasted and honored over the brimming cups. Religion and feasting, worship and eating, were woven together into a single sacred act. Fact 88. Ale and mead played a central, sacred role in these feasts as well. Cups and horns were solemnly toasted to the gods, to Odin, to Thor, to Freya, and to the honored dead, in ritual drinking that was itself a form of worship and remembrance. The passing of the ceremonial cup, the speaking of the toasts, the drinking to gods and ancestors. This was serious, sacred business, and it lay near the heart of how the Norse honored the powers above and the kin who had gone before. To drink in this setting was to pray, and there is a real beauty in that, in the idea that the simple, warm, human act of raising a cup and drinking together could also be an act of reverence, a way of reaching toward the gods and back toward the beloved dead. When the Norse lifted the horn and spoke the name of a god, or of a father or a friend now gone, and drank to their memory, they were doing something that we still do in our own quieter ways, whenever we raise a glass in someone's honor. The forms have changed across the centuries, but the deep human impulse is the very same. To gather, to drink together, and in that shared cup to remember and to honor those we love and those we have lost. Fact 89. Certain foods carried special meaning and were bound up with particular gods and beliefs. The boar was sacred to the god Freyr and to his sister Freyja, and boar meat carried a special significance, especially at Yule, when a boar might be sacrificed and sworn upon. The horse, as we've seen, was bound up with sacrifice too. Even the apple appears in Norse myth as a food of the gods, golden apples kept by the goddess Idun, which the gods ate to keep themselves forever young. Food ran all through the Norse imagination of the divine. Fact 90. The Norse also made food offerings to the smaller, closer spirits of the land and the home, the land spirits, and the household spirits that were thought to dwell in and about the farm. Bowls of food, especially porridge or ale, might be set out for these unseen helpers and guardians, to keep them content and to win their goodwill for the household and the harvest. This gentle, homely piety, the leaving out of a bowl of porridge for the spirits, is a custom that lingered in the folk traditions of the North for many, many centuries after the old gods themselves had faded. Fact 91. And then, slowly, over the 10th and 11th centuries, Christianity came to the North, and it changed the Norse relationship with food in real and lasting ways. The Church brought with it its own calendar of fasts and feasts, its own rules about what might be eaten and when. The many fish days and fast days of the Christian calendar reshaped the eating of whole communities, turning a great share of the days of the year into days of fish and abstinence, just as they did across the rest of Christian Europe. The old feasting continued, but a new rhythm was laid over it. Fact 92. The coming of Christianity struck especially hard at some of the old food customs bound up with pagan worship, and above all at the eating of horse meat. Because horse flesh was so closely tied to the heathen sacrifices, the Church condemned its eating fiercely, and the old sacrificial feasts were suppressed. For a time, as we saw, the willingness to eat horse became almost a test of a person's true faith. The way the Norse ate, and what they were willing to eat, became caught up in the great religious change sweeping over their world. Fact 93. Yet many of the old ways endured, softened and transformed beneath the new faith. The great midwinter feast of Yule did not vanish. It merged with the Christian Christmas, its feasting and its warmth, and its defiance of the dark, carrying on under a new name. Many old foods and customs and beliefs survived by blending quietly into the new Christian framework. The deep human need to feast against the winter dark, to gather and eat and drink together, was far too strong to be swept away, and it simply found new forms to live on in. Now, before we begin to draw near the end of our journey, let's gather up a few more small treasures, a handful of last glimpses into the food world of the Norse. Fact 94. We know so much about all this in part because of archaeology, because of what the Norse left behind in the ground, waiting all these centuries to be found. In the great rubbish heaps, the middens of Norse settlements, archaeologists find the discarded bones of the animals they ate, the shells of the shellfish they gathered, the pips and stones of the fruits they enjoyed, the very seeds of the grains and vegetables they grew. From this humble, ancient rubbish, patiently sifted and studied, we can reconstruct a remarkably detailed picture of what these people truly ate, meal after meal, year after year. Fact 95. Even the bones of the Norse themselves tell us about their food. By studying the chemistry preserved in ancient human skeletons, the isotopes locked into the bone over a lifetime of eating, scientists can tell, in broad terms, whether a person's diet leaned more heavily on food from the land or food from the sea. And such studies confirm just how important fish and marine food were to many Norse communities, especially in the coastal settlements and the islands, where the sea's harvest formed a great and vital part of the everyday diet. Fact 96. The written sagas and poems, though they were mostly written down some centuries after the Viking Age itself, give us wonderful glimpses of Norse food and feasting too, the great halls, the flowing mead, the roasting meat, the passing horn, the rituals and the manners of the table. We must read them with a little care, for they were composed long after and colored by later times and by the storyteller's art. But they preserve, all the same, a precious memory of how the Norse loved to imagine their own feasting, their own hospitality, their own warm and firelit fellowship around the food and the cup. Fact 97. It's worth remembering, too, just how much sheer labor lay behind every single Norse meal, how much work, by how many hands, stood behind that simple bowl of porridge or that piece of flatbread. The grain had to be sown, tended, reaped, threshed, and ground by hand upon the quern. The animals had to be raised, milked, and slaughtered. The milk had to be turned to cheese and butter, the fish caught and dried and salted, the ale brewed, the wood gathered, the fire kept. A Norse meal was the end point of an enormous chain of patient, skilled, unending human effort, and most of it, the daily grinding and milking and brewing and cooking, was the quiet, ceaseless work of women. We so easily picture the Viking Age as a world of dramatic deeds, voyages and battles, and the founding of kingdoms. But beneath all of that, holding all of it up, was this vast, invisible, unglamorous labor, the endless daily work of feeding people. The scrape of the quern stone in the grey dawn. The rhythmic slap of the churn. The bending over the pot, the tending of the fire, the salting and drying and storing, the ceaseless round of milking and cooking and clearing away. It is this quiet, patient, mostly unrecorded work, far more than any battle, that truly kept the Norse world alive, day after day, year after year, and it deserves to be remembered with real gratitude and real respect. Fact 98. And for all its hardness, the Norse diet was, in its way, a genuinely healthy one, much like the peasant diets of the South. It was rich in whole grains, in fish and its good oils, in dairy, in vegetables and legumes and wild berries and greens, and low in the processed foods and the vast quantities of sugar that trouble us today. In a good year, a Norse family ate a diet that a modern nutritionist might well look upon with quiet approval, plain, yes, and monotonous, but wholesome and balanced, and built to sustain a hard-working body through a hard-working life. Fact 99. The great enemy always was not the quality of the food, but the sheer uncertainty of it, the ever-present shadow of the bad year, the failed harvest, the lost livestock, the winter that lasted too long. When the harvest failed or the fishing was poor or disease struck the animals, hunger came swiftly, and it could kill. The whole vast apparatus of Norse food, the farming, the fishing, the foraging, and above all the preserving, was at bottom a great and unceasing effort to hold that hunger at bay, to build a wall of stored food between the family and the darkness. Most years the wall held, but everyone knew in their bones that it might not. And so we come, at last, to our 100th and final fact, the one that gathers up the whole long thread of this journey and ties it gently together. Fact 100. For all the differences we've traveled through tonight, the Thralls' plain porridge and the Jarls' mighty feast, the everyday ale and the sacred mead, the humble flatbread and the golden apples of the gods, there was, in the end, one quiet truth that ran beneath every Norse table, from the poorest turf hut to the greatest firelit hall. It was not the meat of legend, and it was not the flowing mead of the sagas. It was grain, barley, oats, and rye, ground into flour, boiled into porridge, baked into bread, and brewed into ale, formed the true foundation of very nearly everyone's diet, whatever their rank or their wealth. The fierce Viking of our imagination was, first and last, sustained by the humble grain growing quietly in the short northern summer. From the deck of the longship to the high seat of the chieftain's hall, the Viking age was, quietly and fundamentally and always, an age of grain and of milk and of fish, and of the patient, ceaseless human work of turning a hard land and a cold sea into a warm meal, shared around a fire against the dark. So there it is, 100 small facts, gathered slowly from the farms, the halls, the ships, and the cold northern seas of a world we only thought we knew. And what have we truly found, in among all that fierce and warlike legend? Not a people of nothing but blood and battle. Instead, we found farmers rising in the cold before dawn to milk their cows and grind their grain. We've found women turning summer milk into skyr and butter and cheese, and brewing the ale that fed and gladdened the whole household. We've found fishermen hanging their cod to dry in the clean, cold wind, and gatherers filling their baskets with bilberries in the brief, bright summer. We've found families huddled warm around a single fire through the long, dark winter, living carefully off the food they had so cleverly put by. We've found chieftains giving great feasts not out of mere greed, but to bind their people to them with the ancient magic of shared abundance. And we found, at the very heart of their imagined paradise, not endless war, but an endless feast, meat that never runs out, and mead that flows forever, in a hall full of good company that will never, ever grow cold. That, in the end, is what the fierce legend of the Vikings so often hides. Not just raiders and warriors, but people, ordinary people, working with enormous skill and care and ingenuity to feed themselves and one another, season after season, in one of the hardest and most beautiful corners of the world. It's easy, so very easy, to picture the Norse only as figures of violence, storming out of the mist with sword and axe. But if you look a little closer at something as simple and as ordinary and as deeply human as a shared bowl of porridge, or a horn of ale passed hand to hand around a winter fire, you find something warmer glowing there all along. You find people who loved a good meal and a full cup, and the company of their own by the fire, exactly as we do. So the next time you sit down to eat, whatever's on your plate, whatever's in your cup, you might spare a gentle thought for all of them. For the farmer grinding grain in the cold before dawn. For the woman at her churn and her brewing. For the fisherman drawing his catch from the icy sea. For the traveler welcomed in from the storm and given food and warmth and a place by the fire. For the chieftain in his hall and the thrall at the door, and the endless feast they all dreamed waited for them at the end of everything. 1,000 years gone now, all of them, and yet joined to us still by the oldest and simplest thread there is, the daily human need to eat, and the quiet, warm pleasure of sharing it. Thank you for wandering through it all with me tonight. There's nothing more to do now, and nowhere else to be. Let the fire burn low, let the long northern night close softly in, and let yourself drift, gently and easily, down into a deep and peaceful sleep. Rest well, sleep gently. Good night.